Back. In this video, I'm going to be sharing a new story. And this is the real story behind a recent movie with, on the schedule in many cinemas. The title of this movie is Killers of the Flower Moon. And in this story, to be precise, it's how the author of this story, which happened to be a real story, um, explain this true story. It's the story of the Osage nation. And this is based, as I said, on a true story. It's a chilling story. And in the real story, what there is in the real story behind a 1920s murder case. Killers of the Flower Moon dramatize a real historical case from the 1920s that involved multiple murders and chilling criminal conspiracy. It's based on a book written by David Graham, and Martin Scorsese is a new historical film star with a new historical film stars Leonardo DiCaprio, Robert De Niro, and Lily Gladstone. It traces a gruesome series of a killing that rocked an indigenous American community, North America's Midwest. David Graham's book, 2017, it's a non-fiction book, Killers of the Flower Moon, Oil Money, Murder and the Birth of the FBI, was firstly published in 2017, and this basis is the basis of a Martin Scorsese film, 2023 film. It detailed the conspiracy and the horror of the murder's exposure, its impact on the Osage, and the breadth of the tragedy, much of which would remain hidden until decades later. It is a story that was forgotten in the history of the United States for many years, though crucially explained David Graham, not by the Osage nation. I should make it abundantly clear that it was not ignored by the Osage. The Osage remember this history to this day, and for them it remains living history. But for most people in the United States and beyond, they've never heard of this. I had never heard of this. The question is, what was the position of the Osage nation in early 20th century America? The Osage had once controlled much of the Midwest of the country during the 17th century, all the way from the age of Arkansas to the age of the Rockies, explained Graham. And they were a dominant nation. In fact, President Thomas Jefferson, in 1803, referred to them as a great nation. Jefferson also met with several Osage chiefs the following year and promised that they could be treated like friends, but within a few years they were driven off their lands. Like so many Native American nations, says Graham, the Osage were eventually bunched into reservations, losing their territory. The Osage ended up in Kansas on a reservation in the 80s, and they were promised that you'll finally be safe and be left alone. But once more, by the 80s, 60s, the nation was under siege by settlers. There were massacres, says Graham. They were starving and they knew they needed to move on. They were being driven off land again. At this time, as Osage chief considered where the nation might go, he chose an area of land in what would later become northeast Oklahoma, explained Graham, because it's rocky, it's infertile, you can't do agriculture. The chief expressed hope that maybe the white man will finally leave us alone. But in the late 19th century, the United States government legislated that Native American nations needed to break up reservations, the territories that they had been forced on as white settlers had taken their land, in accordance with a law called the Dollars Act. Smaller pieces of land could be parceled instead to individuals. The process was called allotment, explained Graham. And it was done in theory, they would say, because they want to civilize Native Americans and turn them into private property owners. It was also really done so that it could be easier to obtain their land. And this process happened to the Osage as well. They were allotted and their land was broken up. But, Grant explained the Osage had cleverly obtained crucial negotiation with the United States government during the allotment process, that they would maintain all the subsurface, mineral right. Even when their land began to be broken up, they communally controlled all the right to what was underneath. They had some hints that there was oil, but nobody suspected that it was sitting on this huge deposit. The question is, where did the Osage Nation's wealth come from? In 1897, the land that the Osage settled was later discovered to be sitting upon some of the largest deposits of oil than in the United States, while sure enough the surface territory of the Osage Reservation gradually got gobbled up by settlers and disappeared. The right of the minerals underneath were retained. Each person of the Osage Nation was granted what was called a head right. There were only about 2,000 or so Osage. Grant explained, and head right essentially meant that they had a share in the mineral trust. 2,229 head right were granted. When prospectors came into the region and found oil, they had to pay royalties to the Osage, all of which went into the communal pot. Each Osage who had a head right got a percentage of it. A head right could not be sold or bought, says Graham. It could only be inherited, and this was a way to keep that mineral trust within the hands of the Osage. So even as they lost their service land, they were able to hold on to his underground reservation. The question is, how wealthy were the Osage and how did the outsiders react? To give you some sense of the Osage wealth, In 1923, these 2,000 or so Osage received what would be the equivalent today of about 400 million dollars. They were enormously wealthy. This is, of course, believed the long-standing stereotypes of a Native American. Sorry, I lost my way. And American Indians that trace all the way back to the first contact with the settlers. The press could regale the populace with stories of the red millionaire and the plutocratic Osage, and they would describe how they lived in mansions and how they had chauffeurs. They were shocked to report that Osage had white servants who did their menial tasks. They reported that while each American might own a car, each Osage owned 11 of them. This caused a great sensation at that time, and also a great deal of envy. As one Osage chief, Bacon Reed, said, "They bunched us up there, up here, down on this rock, and now that it's worth millions, everybody wants to get a piece of it." Yet, due to the racialized prejudices of the day, although the Osage were millionaires, they sent their children to the best boarding schools. They were very educated, says Graham. The United States government passed legislation that forced Osage people to accept a guardian, a white guardian who could oversee their wealth. What this literally meant is that an Osage who was a millionaire, who may be a chief of a great nation, that when he wanted to go to the store and buy, for instance, a toothpaste, he had a white guardian who had to authorize these purchases. Not only was it great paternalistic and racist, explained Graham, it opened up a system of enormous graft because these guardians began to scheme and get kickbacks and abscond with millions of dollars of the Osages' money. The question is, what was the Osage reign of terror? As the Osage became wealthier from the early 1920s, people began to be mysteriously murdered, one by one, for their old money. The string of murders which are suspected to have been committed between 1921 and 26 took the lives of more than 60 men, women and children, many of the Osage nation, though the final number of victims remain unconfirmed. These crimes were astonishing in their breadth and in their various means. I describe in the book how one Osage family, the family of the woman named Molly Barkard, and played by Lily Gladstone, became a prime target. In May 1921, Molly's elder sister, 24-year-old Anna Kyle Brown, disappeared. Her body was later found in a raving shot to the back of the head. Molly and Anna's mother, Lizzie, died soon afterwards of suspected poisoning. Molly's younger sister, Minnie, had died 3 years earlier, and though it had been attributed to a wasting disease, Molly would later have had doubts. Graham describes a further particularly chilly moment that followed in March 1923. One day, Molly was in her house. It's about 3 in the morning, says Graham. She was asleep in the house that she shared with her husband Ernest Barkand, played by Leonardo DiCaprio. When she felt an enormous explosion, it was so powerful that it shook all the houses for miles in the area. Windows were blown out and shattered. People who were sitting on their chairs were literally blown backwards. When Molly went to the window and she could see a large orange fireball rising into the sky, the fire came from the remains of a house inside which had been Molly's other sister Rita and Rita's husband Bill Smith. Someone had planted a bomb under her sister's house and blown it up, killing her sister and the white servant who lived in the house, says Graham. Billy Smith died in hospital days later, seemingly unable to provide any information as to who had planted the bomb. Rita, sister of Molly Brackard, who was murdered in 1921 when a bomb was placed under her house where she slept. This gives you a sense. There were shooting, there were poisoning, there was a bombing, and these murders began to spread and target various families, not just Molly's family. Over the years that followed, people who might have held crucial evidence or who tried to investigate the murders were also brutally killed, and not just within Oklahoma. One white attorney, Vaughan, is thrown from a moving train while on his way to advocate for further investigation of the Osage killings, while another man who was abducted from his boarding house, a plastic bag placed over his head, his body was found the next day in a raving, beaten to death and stripped naked. There was a sense of a genuine terror. Nobody knew who would become the next target. Many Osage people strung light around their houses at night, so their land was in a permanent glow. So afraid were they of the faceless predators. People wouldn't open their doors. Children were not allowed to wander the street, says Graham. The sense of terror was palpable. The question is, why did the Osage reign of terror continue for so long? All the lawmen in the area were white, explained Graham, and so there was a great deal of prejudice. And because of that, many of these crimes went on to be unsolved. Not just because people had been targeted, but also because there was just such a racial prejudice that people did not treat the victims of these crimes like full-blooded human beings. It's also important to understand that 1920s was remarkably lawless time in the United States, and there were very few competent local police forces, which meant very little training and hardly any forensic evidence. People, including Molly Buckland, pleaded for the authority to investigate the cases, but they were often met with indifference. Molly Barkard besieged the authority to investigate the murder. There was a genuine conspiracy where you had a power structure that was making millions of dollars by pilfering Osage money and by murdering them to get their money. And so there was a complicity, there was a silence, there were willing executioners. The way the society responded is part of the tragedy of these cases. It's pretty abhorrent that for many years bodies piled up and nobody did a damned thing. Molly Barker was one of the Osages who used her own money to fund the private investigators and offer rewards, but often private investigators were themselves easily bought off by the killer or themselves were corrupt. Eventually explained Graham, the Osage Tribal Council issued a formal resolution pleading for federal authorities to send in investigators. These pleas reached an obscure branch of the United States Justice Department, then called the Bureau of Investigation, which would later become known as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. The question is, how were the Osage murders investigated by the FBI? The Osage murders became one of the FBI's first major homicide cases, and also one of the first major homicide cases of its new director, Edgar Hoover. Hoover had been named acting director in 1924, then a 29-year-old with dreams of building a bureaucratic empire, says Graham. But at the time of the Osage murder, Hoover was still very insecure in his job. He was trying to professionalize the bureau and brought in more formal training, college educations, and adopted more forensics. But the Bureau initially badly bungled this case. For 2 years there was no arrest, and most famously they had made a huge, embarrassing, bloody mistake. To gain evidence, they had taken an outlaw informant out of prison. The informant managed to slip the Bureau forces and proceeded to rob a bank and kill a police officer. Hoover, facing a potential scandal, brought in a frontier lawman and former Texas Ranger, a man named Tom White. White put together a quite extraordinary undercover team. He took several old frontier agents, one of them posed as an insurance salesman and actually set up an insurance office in town on the reservation and then sold real insurance policies. Another undercover operative was Cattleman, and perhaps most remarkably, an American Indian agent was recruited. There were no statistics back then, says Graham, so we don't know for sure, but he was probably the only American Indian agent in the Bureau at the time, especially given the prejudices. He went in undercover as well, and they began to infiltrate the region. They retained deep cover because there was such a sense of terror. They didn't think they could get people to talk, but they also did it because anyone was going to try to stop the killing were being killed, and so they were marked men. This was a very dangerous operation, and in many ways for Tom White it became both a criminal operation and almost like a spy operation because there were moles, there were double agent or threats of a triple agent. The operatives were being followed and trailed while they were carrying out their investigations. They were threatening to tear down a very powerful system and structure. What White's team began to discover was that the guardians, many of whom had been appointed to protect the Osage and their fortune, were in many cases criminals. These were, in theory, the leading citizens in society. They were often bankers and lawmen and politicians. They were, in effect, using their power to steal and graft. Another important thing to understand is that the Bureau, the precursor to the FBI was just emerging from its own corruption scandal. The Teapot Dome oil reserves scandal, in which were members of the Bureau and Justice Department and had accepted kickback from oil men. All this corruption, this kind of sinister, garish corruption, is part of the backdrop in which this investigation is taking place. The mastermind behind the conspiracy that carried out the murders of at least Anna, Liz, Rita, and their husband Bill Smith was a man named William Hale, played in the movie by Robert De Niro. The cow wrangler and farmer turned self-made respectable businessman, Hale was at the heart of the conspiracy to funnel head right of other Osage toward Molly Barker, the wife of his nephew Ernest. The plan seemingly was for Hale and Ernest to lay claim to Molly's entire fortune in the event of her death. It came light that she was also being slowly poisoned, supposedly treatment of diabetes. When she was removed from the care of Ernest and two doctors at the local doctor, Molly regained health rapidly. Hale had held the immense influence over his nephews Ernest and Brian, and had coerced them into carrying out their part in an evil conspiracy, including Ernest's involvement in planting an explosive, under the house of Bill and Rita, and Brian's part in Anna's murder. Even when they caught Hale, they didn't know if they could ever prosecute him because they didn't know if they could get 12 jurors, given the prejudice at the time to even rule against him, despite the abundance of evidence. The result was an immensely volatile and protracted legal battle, during which Hale used means of bribery and intimidation to evade conviction for any crimes. After more than 2 years, Hale, along with Ernest Buckard and several accomplices, was sentenced to jail time. What is shocking in this story is that we often like to think of evil as a singular figure. And if you catch that figure and purge it, society returns to normal. And in this case, it was one man that was an embodiment in many ways of evil. William Hale, in this case, it was one man who was an embodiment in many ways of evil. But the case was not limited to Hale crimes. But there were also a vast amount of conspirators in the Osage murder. Many of them on the outside seem like perfectly ordinary, law-abiding citizens, but they were participants and they would cover up the crimes. Lawmen helped cover up murders. Those who buried victims covered up that there was a gunshot wound in the head or that the person had been poisoned. This was complicity of a silence by even those who were not directly profiting. The fact that these people were Osage, that is, that they were Native Americans, allowed these crimes to be covered up and to be treated differently than if the victims had been white. The truth be said, even though the Bureau was able to resolve many of the cases, and Tom White, who was in many ways a very good man, who was quietly a good man, and there is a lot of goodness in the story, not just evil, but even with the Bureau's effort, the breadth of the conspiracy was far wider and far darker than the Bureau ever exposed. Why were the Osage murders forgotten? The case initially got plenty of exposure in 1930. American sensationalists in the press of the day and J. Edgar Hoover used to be sought to solving, the solving of some of the murder as a of cause celebrity to showcase the effectiveness of this bureau. But by the 1930, Hoover used other cases to publicize his war on crime. There was John Dillinger, there were other outlaws. He paid less attention to this case, but also, I think the victim don't write history. It's a cliche, but it's true. And so many of the victims are people who, even though they had wealth, were more of the margin of society. And there was a great deal of racial prejudice. I think there was, whether consciously or unconsciously, an exercising of these from history. It's shocking that these crimes have not been more widely known beyond the Osage remembering. This is unquestionably one of the most sinister crimes in American history, one of the worst racial injustices in American history, also an incredibly important chapter in American history, because these forces of the clash between Native Americans and white, and this is the terrible story that I want to share with you. Thank you so much for watching.